So hard power is essentially bullying a nation. He usually gets what he wants by threatening and coercing people. I don't think it's been successful at all to a certain degree. Perhaps even the removal of, for example, Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. What has he achieved there? What he essentially he's replaced one person of the Maduro government with another person in the Maduro government, and pretty much the same has happened in Iran.
Hi, I'm Harry Adams, and this is the Beacon Podcast, where we discuss the rise of populism and the threat it poses. In our latest interview, I spoke to Dr. Dafydd Townley, a US foreign policy and international security expert and lecturer at Portsmouth University. We discussed this Trump administration's approach to foreign policy in comparison to the last one, why the US seems to favour hard over soft power, and whether the UK-US special relationship actually still exists. Hi Dafydd, thanks so much for joining us. So, my first question is, can you outline a little bit about what has changed from the previous Trump administration to this one in terms of foreign policy and how you think it's changed and what you think that means in a wider sense?
Well, I think there's a number of things. So first of all, if we compare the first Trump administration, which has had what we might call adults in the room, shall we say, in terms of particularly important positions within the White House, within, for example, the West Wing, and within those close to Trump, people like, for example, the White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense, for example. These have been, certainly during the first administration, they were people who had significant experience in politics, significant experience in the areas in which they were involved. Mattis, for example, in defence, and so on. And this meant that they had an understanding not just of how the world worked. I think that's important to understand that, but also what the United States' obligations and responsibilities as they viewed it were. And that's something that has continued from arguably 1945 up until the present day. There's been a few changes since the end of the Cold War, for example, but as far as the United States is concerned, it's pretty much been there to protect Western democracy, to advance the notion of democracy, to push forward stable economies with which it can trade. And it has done this through a combination of soft power and hard power. So the idea, the soft power that, that nations would want to share in sort of cultural exchanges, adopt certain things. Britain is a great example of that. Look at, for example, our popular culture is very much aligned in many ways with the United States through that relationship that we've had with them since the end of the Second World War. Pop music, for example, cinema, TV, all of those sort of things, but also the idea that we are somehow intertwined with American democracy as well. We look across the United States, and in some cases we think along the lines of, we'd like to vote for a president rather than have a prime minister. Or at least in many cases, some of us think we do vote for a prime minister and not for a member of parliament. Now, in the 4 years that the Trump administration, the Trump circle has been out of power, it has managed to think about a great number of things. First of all, it's learned from its mistakes during that first administration, and it's come up with a plan. Trump didn't have a plan in 2017. He wasn't expected to be elected in November of 2016. If you can remember that far back, Hillary Clinton was an odds-on, to use betting parlance, favourite to win the election. And so Trump was very much a surprise winner. Not for everybody, but for most people. And to that extent, he didn't really have a strategy or a long-term plan what he was going to do if he was in office for 4 years. He had promised a lot of things to a lot of people without sort of joining up the dots and how to work all that out. This time, he's come into this administration with a plan. Certainly, as far as this administration is concerned, it has, through Project 2025, the blueprint that has been written by the Heritage Foundation, a think tank in Washington, D.C. It has a clear, identifiable strategy to consolidate a great deal of governmental power within the executive branch so that it can operate without being subject to the checks and balances of the American government system. Now, this means that, for example, the Congress is weakened in many respects, or could be weakened in many respects, regarding trying to challenge Trump on doing things. Now, at the moment, I'd say it doesn't matter. At the moment, that's not a major consideration because the House of Representatives and the Senate are both Republican and are pretty much in line with what the Trump administration wants to do on most things. Not everything, but most things. And so that might change after November when we have the midterm elections and when it's likely that the Democrats will take over the House and might well take over the Senate as well. And so that might lead us to the same sort of situation that we had at the end of the first Trump administration, where congressional Democrats were very much put in a block on a lot of things that Trump wanted. And so this administration has tried to consolidate a great deal of power into its administration so it can do it without Congress saying no. So, for example, its decision to step back from supporting Ukraine, for example, in the way that it has done during its first administration and during the Biden administration. It's certainly its challenges towards NATO and European security, and certainly its ideas of, for example, its aspirations towards Greenland or Venezuela, or its actions in Iran. Now, there has been some pushback on a lot of these, but not enough from the Republicans to really warrant any sort of check to Trump exerting his influence. Now, I think in terms of the tools, and I said in his first administration, or at least certainly from the 1940s onwards, the United States has used both soft power and hard power. And this Trump administration has really been all about abandoning soft power tools. It's disbanded things like foreign aid, so it has dissolved the United States Agency for International Development, which was a crucial agency that was a sort of a sister agency to the State Department that worked in a lot of places like Ukraine, for example, at ground level, identifying issues that people might have, for example, in security or simply in getting the energy grid working or things like that, or protecting cybersecurity around things such as hydroelectric dams in Africa. All of these things, US aid were really important in creating those relationships and financing some of those things as well. And this administration, partly through its cost-cutting initiatives, put through by DOGE and supported by the Office of Management and Budget, headed by Russ Fort. This has essentially put an end to those. It's essentially decided that it would not be worthwhile spending that money. It was viewed as a significant cost that could be avoided, and this is an administration that is very much, along the Republican lines of low public cost and low public expenditure. So that's one way that it's done that. It's done it also, through various things such as, I would say in this first administration, it was reluctant to appoint people to the State Department. The State Department had huge numbers of vacancies, which meant that it operated rather dysfunctionally. And instead, where it's not replaced those in its second term with what you might call professional civil servants, professional foreign service individuals. Instead, it's replaced them with Trump loyalists who are willing to do what Trump says rather than do what is best for the United States. But we've also seen this administration hugely step back from a number of multilateral agreements that it has got involved in, things like the Paris Accords, etc., etc. Anything climate change related has been stepped back from. We've seen Trump at the UN last year talk about how climate change is a scam, shocking the members there. But pretty much anything that is associated with multilateral agreements has either been reassessed, renegotiated, or withdrawn from. But even things such as, for example, NATO. Its attitude towards NATO has been completely different to any administration in the past. It has followed through on threats that previous presidents have not necessarily made but have warned might emerge. So, for example, Trump has, recently withdrew, I think it was 6,000 troops out of Germany. Barack Obama said back in 2014 that the United States will not always be there. And if we go back as far as Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, he warned the European members that they needed to spend more money on defence. This is something that has always been a grievance for American presidents, but they've understood the benefits of their presence in Europe. You know, the soft power benefits that come with it. We station troops here, you buy our goods, you give us better trade deals, etc. And that has not really been understood by the Trump administration as being a priority.
I spoke quite a lot in that answer about soft and hard power. Can you give a brief overview as to what that actually is for people who maybe don't know what the differences are there and what each one means?
So nations have essentially levers of power, tools that they can influence other nations to get what they want, to achieve strategic objectives. And these have broadly been classified into hard power and soft power tools. So hard power would be is a use of these tools, which are often split into the acronym of DIME, which is diplomacy, information, military, and economic. And different powers fall under, or different tools fall under those classifications. Each of them actually can be hard power or soft power, depending on how they're used. And I'll give some examples. So hard power is essentially bullying a nation. It's telling a nation to do something much against its will. You know, we want you to change your regime. We want you to sign this negotiation, a trade deal, or so on. And in terms of hard power, tariffs are a hard power because you're imposing something against their will on another nation. Sanctions, military action, or the threat of military action, for example, is hard power. And things like offensive or propaganda campaigns, for example. Soft power, on the other hand, is about trying to get a nation to think the way that you want to think. And a perfect example of soft power achieving its objectives is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. You know, the Berlin Wall didn't fall as a result of tanks or troops or missiles or jet strikes. It fell because the people on the eastern side of the wall wanted to have the political system and the culture and everything else of those on the western side of the wall. So they knocked the wall down themselves. And, you know, soft power is nothing new. We have done, you know, in UK has done pretty much that arguably since the 17th, 18th century, and its expansion of its mercantile and then the empire around the globe. United States has been particularly good at it in terms of using things in the post-war era like the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine to essentially say that we will support you, we will give you money, we will help you out with your infrastructure, we'll give you favored deals if you decide to, you know, think along the way that we do and oppose communism, for example, during the Cold War. And examples of soft power that, you know, that we use are things like, for example, the royal family. Incredibly popular. Look at King Charles's recent visit to the United States. You know, he is supposedly a non-political or apolitical figure, but what he went across there, he spoke on behalf of the UK government, you know, without being officially a member of that. That's a good example. Other examples might be, for example, sport. Premier League, for example, in this country is the most watched football league in the world. Everybody wants to come and be a part of the Premier League, or at least most people do.
So it's quite an interesting example of that, because I remember when the Super League was discussed, there was actually Boris Johnson sort of waded in, and maybe people who might have thought, why is he wading into this? And it's actually because the Premier League, although it's an entertainment product, actually it's soft power massively.
Yeah.
And
Well,
in the same way with the BBC and the World Service, and it's quite an they sit in quite an interesting sphere.
University institutions as well. So it's a cultural attraction. Probably the biggest advertisement of the UK as a soft power tool was the 2012 opening ceremony at the Olympics. The celebration of everything that was British. It was probably, obviously I'm biased because I am British, but it was probably one of the most effective and celebrated opening sequences to an Olympic ceremony of the last 30 or 40 years. And it did exactly what it was supposed to do, because there were world leaders at that ceremony who could then say, well, actually, we want to be a part of that. We want to be, we want to have or replicate that back at home. How do we do it? How do we do things along those lines? The Red Arrows is a soft power tool. Now, the Red Arrows I think it was 2017, did their first combat or aerial display, sorry, not combat display, aerial display in China. And that was a huge moment because the Red Arrows don't go anywhere on their own. They go with British business, they go with British industry, they go with British politicians, they go with the military. And so what happens is in their tail, although the front of the exhibition is the Red Arrows, look at these great jets, what come with them is people making links and businesses back to the UK, so its economy and its diplomacy and everything else benefits on top of that. And anything short of combat or the training of overseas officers, for example, like we have done with Ukraine.
It had negative conceptions, I suppose, by the end maybe, but it's that hearts and minds thing, right? In Iraq and Afghanistan. So to talk on the US. The US is maybe like their deviation from soft power and the Trump administration's determination to attack, or maybe just try and dismantle, or at least question these organizations and these institutions that promote soft power or Western soft power. Do you see that as a mistake? Do you see this hard power, hard man approach from the US as maybe a mistake? And do you think it's a symptom of populism, or do you just think it's this administration?
Is this just this administration? I hope so. I hope so because I think there is a limitation to just using hard power. Joseph Nye, the great Harvard scholar who wrote about soft power, came up with the term soft power in the 1990s, a famous essay in, I think it was Foreign Affairs magazine, and then wrote a book about it. He wrote another book in about 2016, 2017, called Smart Power. I might have it on my bookshelf somewhere at some point. And essentially, he talks about the idea that a strategy that just relies on hard power loses some of its legitimacy. It can be seen as being a bully. Okay, if you go in and you just use hard power to, think, for example, look at Russia. Okay, Russia in Ukraine. It tried to use hard power to bully Ukraine by assembling, huge numbers of troops on its border and on its border with Belarus to force Ukraine to hold elections to get rid of a Western favouring government. That's what it was doing. And it threatened to use those troops should they not do it. And obviously that's been, pretty much, apart from very few instances, it's been pretty much condemned around the globe. So Joseph Nye said, well, if you do that, you're just going to get bullied and actually people won't support you. He said, but on the other hand, you can't always just use soft power. Okay, it's sometimes you do need to, what he calls, get out the big stick. And his perfect example is Afghanistan. The United States have tried to use soft power to convince the Taliban to give up al-Qaeda in the early part of the 21st century. And because there wasn't that attraction, because Afghanistan didn't want to have, or at least Taliban didn't want to have Western democracy and Western culture, that the soft power failed. So they had to incorporate hard power into their strategy to defeat the Taliban. And then he said in 2016, 2017, if they incorporated soft power effectively, they could ensure that their long-term strategy of having a pro-American government, or at least an American-friendly government in place, would have worked by making sure that people suddenly saw the benefits of all these schools being built, these hospitals being built, personal freedoms for women, all that sort of thing. I'd like to think that that this is a momentary aberration. And we see things like, for example, hard power is important to this administration. I think it's important for a number of reasons. So first of all, it's important because this is how Trump does business. If we look back on Trump's Trump's career as a businessman, the way he does business is he usually does it from a position of power. He usually gets what he wants by threatening and coercing people. Again, if we look at Project 2025, he views himself as somebody who should be able to say, I want this, get it done.
Mm.
And he looks across people like President Xi, for example, in China, and Putin and Kim and so on. And he says, well, if they can do it, why can't I do it? Of course, they have a very different government system. They don't have democratic systems in place. That's how they can do it. So for him, hard power is just merely his methodology. It's his normal methodology of getting things done. And we can see how that's been, he's also quite a narcissist in that respect as well. Things like, for example, the 250th celebration of the US Army, or at least Congress's army, just happened to coincide with his birthday last year. And he had that huge parade in Washington, D.C., very similar to how these strong men in these countries have their parades. Although the Russian parade recently was quite toned down, but China had one last, I think it was September, October, that was incredibly expressive of its power. And even silly things like, so on May the 4th last year, the White House released a picture on their Twitter accounts, or X account, of Trump as a Jedi Knight. With rippling muscles, flanked by US flags and US eagles, sort of portraying him as being some sort of holy crusader, very strong. We can look at things, for example, like I'm going to call it an attempt because it's not legal, an attempt to rename the Department of Defense as a Department of War. Okay, because only Congress can rename that, and Congress haven't done it. But that's far more important, or that's important to this administration, because war sounds tougher. War sounds more of a deterrent than defence. And so we have these language and images that are very important to this administration. Now, do I think that this has been successful? I don't think it's been successful at all, to a certain degree. Perhaps even the removal of, for example, Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, which is probably one of the clearest shows of hard power, has been essentially, what has he achieved there? What he essentially he's replaced one person of the Maduro government with another person in the Maduro government, and pretty much the same has happened in Iran. His show of power in Iran, yes, it's been rather impressive. Certainly, they're talking now about having these, I think they're called Dark Eagle hypersonic missiles deployed to the Middle East now. It's all about a show of strength, but they haven't really actually achieved anything. And in fact, strategically, you would argue that what they're fighting for now is what the situation was like before they actually took place. And it's cost them the best part of $30 billion.
I think there's actually a quote from Marco Rubio that I've seen in the last 24 hours where he's basically saying, we will get it back open again. And you're like, you've kind of just said you're going to do you're going to get back what existed in the first place.
It's an interesting story. There's a visual story that you can get of the clips of Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, and Donald Trump trying to explain, number one, what was the objective of the actual political objective of the conflict. And it changes from day to day and from person to person. They contradict each other. They contradict themselves, Marco Rubio in particular. Marco Rubio opened up, I think it was on day 2, saying, well, we went in because the Israelis were going to go in and we didn't want to be targeted. Then he came back the following day and said, no, because Donald Trump said, that's why we did it. And then Donald Trump said, well, I did it because I just felt as though we were going to be attacked, although there's no intelligence support that we were going to be attacked. Then he said it was about being potentially a nuclear attack, which of course was supposed to be neutralized last year, was celebrated by the administration as being neutralized last year during the bombing of the nuclear facilities in June of 2025. So, it's in terms of has it been a success? No, I think it has been an awful failure. And what it's doing, even the use of tariffs, for example, has impacted Americans. This Trump administration has been I wouldn't say clever, but has been determined to portray this as something that's been paid for by overseas nations. It's not. It's being paid for by Americans at the till, and companies in America, and essentially, it's pushing its business partners to other business partners. Canada, who is arguably, I know we're going to talk about special relationship, is arguably the United States' closest partner in pretty much everything, is now doing a huge amount of business in response to the tariffs with China. This is so it's counterproductive to a certain extent. So my assessment of the Trump administration is I can understand why Trump does it, okay, and I think that's partly because he does it because that's the way he feels comfortable with doing things. I think he also does it because there's nobody in the room to tell him. There's no adults in the room to tell him you can't, for example, invade Greenland. You can't bomb Iran without a strategic objective. That there's nobody there to tell him no. It's become quite a, you listen to some of the cabinet meetings and the first 30 to 40 minutes are just all the different cabinet secretaries telling him how wonderful he is and what a great president. He's the best president ever. It's become very much a sort of almost a cult of a personality cult to a certain degree. And so from a strategic and political objective, it's been almost a failure to a certain extent because we have, what is now being called by Democrats as these taco moments on every strategy. Trump always chickens out, and it's, he makes these threats, he's going to do it, and we can look at Greenland as an example of that. I'm going to invade, I'm going to put tariffs on those who opposed me, and he does neither of those things and hasn't achieved anything except alienate his allies even further.
Do you think there's an element as well with Iran particularly that the Trump administration underestimated national resilience or the like the Revolutionary Guard or whatever element of it you want to point to? We started this conversation, we were talking about grown-ups in the room. And when you've got effectively a leader who is reliant on like a cult of personality surrounded by sycophants, no one then saying, actually, these guys aren't just going to be bullied, they just go along with it anyway. And you've seen like Vance kind of say, I didn't think Iran was a good idea, but I did it because the president wanted to do it. And you're kind of seeing these, like, I wouldn't call them fractures because I don't think we're at that stage yet, but there's definitely like the Iran particularly has been something that the US cabinet, like Trump's cabinet, have kind of maybe distanced themselves from him slightly or admitted that it's been a mistake.
So there is the assumption that this administration was elected to power on the idea that it would not get held up or involved in what are called forever wars, okay, the so-called forever wars. And that's something that Project 2025 really does, say that the United States needs to stop doing that. Strangely enough, Project 2025 and the National Security Strategy that came out in November of last year and the National Defense Strategy that came in January talks about reducing the United States' footprint in the Middle East, whereas actually it's just increased its footprint quite significant some months later. But there are fractures. There are fractures within the Republican Party. So, when you've got a Trump administration that has been criticised by Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of his greatest supporters over the last 10 years, you would have to say that that he's diverging from these people to a certain degree. Is that an indication that the party is splitting? I think there are some things that Republicans in Congress would dig their heels in about. Even NATO, for example, many would not support that. Some, Iran has been the great enemy since 1979 to the United States. Of course, the United States perhaps doesn't realise it's been the great enemy to Iran since 1953, when it supported the coup of Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah as almost a dictator in 1953, and supported the Shah up until 1979. So for many, Iran was seen as an opportunity, and there has been some discussions recently about also, Trump has said he'd like to get control of Cuba. But I would argue that that Project 2025 is not about isolationism, never has been. It's about limited engagement. selective engagement where the United States can see it's in their interest. However, I don't understand what the interest was in Iran, and as you mentioned, nobody in the room, willing to criticise any sort of strategy. I'm still shocked that nobody pointed out that that the first thing Iran would do if it was attacked would be to close the Straits of Hormuz, and the impact
Arguably the
that it
only
would
thing
have.
they could do. You
Sorry.
know, I said arguably one of the only things they could do, and yet no one seemed to point it
Which
out.
is why nobody's invaded Iran, since oil has become a major commodity, because it's just you just can't do that. Economic experts were warning in week 3, week 4 of this conflict, and I think we're now in week 10, that if this extends into a long-term closure, we will have the biggest energy crisis that the world has seen. And Trump has obviously not been told, well, don't worry, we've got enough oil. We can supply, but actually doesn't understand that his oil market is inexorably linked to the global oil market. And if the price of Brent crude goes up, then American petrol is going to go up. And so that's been very much a failure as well. How do we mitigate against a president like Donald Trump? How does the world mitigate against him?
Especially when talking about resilience and like oil markets and stuff, where it's affecting consumers in the UK as much as it's affecting consumers in the US.
One of the great benefits of Brexit was supposed to be a closer economic relationship with the United States. That we wouldn't be tied to the European Union's agreement with the United States, that we could go solo. That hasn't emerged. Okay, we don't have that huge benefit we first thought. But at the same time, we are not part of that consortium or collection of states to leverage power against Trump. And so that has an impact on us. As far as energy is concerned, certainly, when we think about, if we look back over the last 7 years, the price of electric and gas into most people's homes has at least doubled in this country. First, because of the Ukraine conflict, and then because of what's going on in the Gulf and so on. How do we leverage against that? Well, we are almost wholly reliant on, or very significantly reliant on, imported energy into this country and imported sources of energy. Nuclear energy, in my opinion, is an excellent way to go forward. It has a bad press, but I think that's undeserved. But it's going to take at least a decade, maybe 20 years, for us to become sort of self-sufficient if we move to nuclear energy. And it also require significant investment from a government that is working along strict economic guardrails. In terms of politically, how can we do that? Well, the only way we can do that is to mitigate ourselves from Trump, is essentially to either to find alternative partners with which to do trade, alternative sources, in terms of supply chains, but we're sort of stuck as far as that is concerned. But it's sort of, Trump is enough of a wild elephant to essentially to damage pretty much any industry that he gets involved in. So the UK and US do have a special relationship, and for the past 80 years, it has been the special relationship for the UK. Okay, it's been the number one relationship that we've had with the rest of the world. However, it is one of many special relationships to the United States. And one would argue up until this administration, Canada was probably the special relationship for the United States in terms of a trading partner, and just geographical links and so forth. So however, I would agree with the UK ambassador that this administration, which is, in some ways echoing what it did in its first administration, moving the embassy, for example, to Jerusalem, which was a huge, which most administrations had refused to do that, has a very strong relationship with Israel. To a certain extent, that many are asking, is the United States involved in Iran of its own accord, or is it going along with what Israel wants? Because there has certainly been other Israeli premierships and other Israeli governments who have turned around and said, we're going to bomb Iran, that the Americans have turned around and said, no, you're not, and refused to give this back in. But for this Trump administration, this has certainly been important. Does does the UK relationship still exist? Well, we can think about some of the, if you look over the last 7-8 months, so we withdrew our intelligence sharing relationship with the United States in the Caribbean, as far as the Caribbean is concerned, when the US started targeting Venezuelan drug boats. Okay, I'd say targeting, destroying Venezuelan drug boats. And that wasn't because we didn't want to end Venezuelan importation of drugs into the United States. It's not a significant priority for us, but it's because our government felt as though it was operating outside of its outside of international law, and so it felt. And so it felt that by giving information, by giving intelligence, which the UK is quite strong on in the Caribbean, to the United States, it was somehow condoning that and being a partner to breaking international law. So it refused to do that. I think the King's visit 2 weeks ago now was incredibly positive. I think it was well received. I think it's probably, as far as Trump personally is concerned, I think it's the biggest weapon that the British government can use, because Trump, if you saw King Charles make a number of jokes at Trump's expense to a certain degree, with a grin on his face, and Trump, if you watch Trump's reactions, they are as if to say, he's quite clear he admires Charles. I wouldn't say enamored, but he is an Anglophile. And he loves the royal family, and it was, I think that that it was a weapon that was very well used, and I think it still is a relationship that is special in many cases, but not as special as it once was. But I think that it has the potential to turn back. Circumstances will change that elsewhere.
Moving on slightly, but definitely tied to what we've been speaking about, this idea of cyber diplomacy. We've mentioned so far numerous examples of clips or posts or things that have been put out in the cyber domain from Trump and other politicians. Can you explain a little bit about what cyber diplomacy is?
Yeah. So cyber diplomacy is essentially like it's another tool in the government toolbox under the diplomatic lever. Now, what it is essentially, it's a series of discussions, negotiations, and agreements between nations how they should interact within cyberspace. How nations should, for example, treat each other's national domains, for example, how they might use cyberspace in a military capacity or an offensive capacity. It's about setting established and agreed norms of behaviour, as diplomats like to call it, so that everybody signs up, for example, that they won't conduct cyber attacks on nuclear power stations. Okay, it's in everybody's interest that doesn't happen. But it might also be about helping to attribute cyber attacks from within one nation, for example. Now, this is something that is developed. The first cyber diplomat was in the it was in the Obama administration, a guy called Chris Painter, and he was the world's first cyber diplomat. And this is something that has been certainly picked up around the globe. The Foreign Commonwealth Development Office have their cyber envoy, for example, and there's various different institutions or organizational groups within United Nations that work together. Probably the most influential of this is the OEWG, the Open-Ended Working Group, which is an agreement about various different nations, including Russia, for example, and China, about how to establish things like, what to do about disinformation, misinformation, what to do about where the legality about servers in different countries stands, for example, how to enforce cyber law is also a very important thing. Now, these aren't laws as such; these are just agreements. That's an important thing, and laws have changed around the globe. So, for example, we might think that everybody has the same sort of agreement around around emerging technology, but if we look at artificial intelligence, for example, as just one example, Europe has a very clear guidelines or strict guidelines on how AI can be developed. The UK deliberately hasn't, although it is trying to attract investment in AI in this country by making it extremely attractive to overseas organisations, I should say. However, there are some stepping stones that need to be negotiated around the sort of the environmental impact of these huge data servers. And the United States has very little in terms of restrictions on how AI is being developed. In fact, this Trump administration is very enthusiastic towards it. And AI is important when it comes to cyberspace, because, especially cybersecurity, because it has the ability to transform or weaken cybersecurity or strengthen cybersecurity through the use of AI agents, for example, that can essentially get through things like passwords and firewalls, etc., quite quickly. So as far as this administration is concerned, again, if we compare the first administration to the second administration, the first Trump administration, when it brought out its national security strategy, I think in 2018, I think it was, cyber was huge. It was a massive investment in cyber, promised a massive investment in cyber, much more than the Obama administration was. It spoke about the use of cyber, about establishing, frameworks for which nations need to operate within, about holding nations to account. But this second administration hasn't. In fact, what it's done, it's pretty much wound down a great deal of its tools that it uses. So, for example, the State Department had something called the Cyberspace and Digital Policy, which was the CDP, which had the first official cyber diplomat in it, under Joe Biden. It was established under Joe Biden. That has been disbanded. Essentially, we just got a senior official now, and that office was incredibly important because he was essentially the point guard for everybody within the administration to take their cyber issues around the globe. He could operate in that respect. It's also cut down things like, well, I already mentioned the United States Agency for International Development. That was another agency that it used to establish relationships with cyber communities and governments around the globe. For example, Ukraine needed help with its energy grid after it had been hacked in 2014, I think it was, maybe 2015. USAID had the understanding and knowledge and the connections to make sure that people like Microsoft, people like Elon Musk, and the Ukrainians could come together to make sure that their energy network was, essentially working and safely working together. And of course, that works for the United States because, again, it's soft power. Come and have our systems. You want to be on our system. But they've stripped that down. But they've also stripped down a lot of money from CISA, the Cyberspace and Infrastructure Security Agency, which opened I'm not going to say an embassy. It opened a consulate of sorts in London. And this is the organisation in the US that consolidates all the infrastructure cybersecurity, and it's sort of sharing its standards and its knowledge with various other countries around the world. And opening up, a consulate in UK was extremely important in just going back to that special relationship, in identifying that it too could learn off the UK. But the United States doesn't see cyber in that respect. It doesn't want, to a certain extent, the limitations placed on it, partly because, it likes using cyber in offensive capability. We know that what's been going on in Iran, for example, has had a huge amount of cyber activity involved in it. We know that cyber was involved in their bombing of the Iranian uranium facilities last year as part of Operation Midnight Hammer. And of course, this is an administration that is very much plugged into the whole digital network around podcasting, alternative news, around misinformation or has been responsible for misinformation and disinformation as well. We can look through that that whole output from the so-called alt-right. That's contributed towards some of the stuff that the Trump administration has acted.
I was going to ask as well, does rhetoric come into that? Does rhetoric or is that semi-separate?
I think it does to a certain degree. The United States, First Amendment is about free speech. Of course, not everybody has free speech in the United States. You can't, for example, criticize this administration. The press has been restricted in access to various parts of the government if they are critical of this administration, and you see very much Trump administration press officials, or what might be called alternative press, new media perhaps is probably the best phrase, and get access where others don't. But Trump loves the fact that he can say things online that are outlandish. He's had a habit of doing that since the 1980s, and it's just his True Social, which is a network, don't forget, that was essentially built to accommodate him being banned from Twitter for essentially for hate speech in 2021. Sorry, it's essentially along those lines of that it allows him to put forth a lot of what might be termed as populist views, and it allows people to come together who share those same views. And if you don't have guardrails, and if you don't have organizations and institutions that are willing to challenge that, which this administration doesn't, then it's terrible.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Not a problem.